Coming home does not always mean that you feel safe. Sometimes it means you keep your back to the wall, scan every exit, and carry a weight so deep that you stop talking to the people that you even love most. There is a way forward, though, and it starts by naming what has been eating at you. Our guest today, Larry Brant, helps unpack the difference between PTSD and moral injury, why guilt and shame can drive veterans into silence, and how faith, honest conversations, and the right kind of group support can start restoring trust at home, in your own head, and in your relationship with God. You'll walk away from this episode with language for what you may be carrying and a clearer sense of where your healing can begin. But before we get into this episode, I do want to take a moment to raise awareness for something that's deeply important to our community, the Global War on Terrorism Memorial Foundation. This organization is working to build a permanent national memorial in Washington, D.C. to honor the service members, families, and civilians who are impacted by the global war on terrorism. This memorial will be both a tribute to those who've served and a way to ensure that their sacrifices are recognized and remembered for generations to come. If you'd like to learn more or find out how you can support their mission, visit gwatmemorialfoundation.org. Now let's get into today's episode. Hey, Larry, welcome to the show. Really glad to have you here.
I am stoked to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
Yeah, absolutely. And like I said before we started recording, I've been looking forward to our conversation. So I think it's going to be a pretty great episode here for the listeners. So before we get into the meat of the conversation, though, could you maybe just start by introducing yourself, telling a little bit about yourself and who you are?
Sure. I'm Dr. Larry Brant, which is still kind of weird to say because I just got the doctorate in May. So it feels late still.
Sure.
I'm currently an active duty Navy chaplain. I'll be leaving the Navy this summer. 17 years of active duty service. And before that, I spent 25 years as associate pastor in various Baptist churches. I was actually the music pastor. And so I have a bachelor's and master's degree in music and worship in churches for 25 years and also did youth ministry, vocational ministry. And then in the last church I was in, which was in Lincoln, Nebraska, I had some police and firefighters in the congregation approach me about doing chaplaincy for the city. They went to my senior pastor and I said, "Do you mind if I do this?" And he said, "No, absolutely not. Please do." And it was a great experience for 8 years. And over that time, God blessed, and I eventually led the ministry for the city and had about 25 volunteer police and firemen from across various denominations there in Lincoln, Nebraska. And it was a great experience. And during that, I went to a chaplaincy training led by my denomination. And there, God's calling to be a Navy chaplain, kind of like at Moses at the burning bush. I tried to tell God how wrong he was in that. And I thought I had, three great arguments there. The first argument was, I was already too old. I was already past the cutoff. Next session, they talked about these things called age waivers. And then I said, well, I don't have the right degree because I had a master's of church music and a master of leadership. And they talked brand new things called online accredited seminaries. Then I really thought I had him at the third one. And I said, God, I'm a big boy. At that point in my life, I weighed over 300 pounds. And God said, there's this thing called diet and exercise. So I said, okay, God, if that's what you want me to do, I'll do it. But I would tell my wife the idea of sharing that with her terrifies me. And she was with me at that conference. And funny enough, that very night, we went back to the room to talk about stuff. And I'm dreading it. I feel like I'm on the long walk to the gallows, getting ready to rock this poor woman's world. And we get to the room and she turns around and says, I think God's calling you to military chaplaincy. And I was like, wow, he really did tell her. We're just so amazed when we ask big things of God and then we're shocked when he comes through.
Sure.
And so then that started a year and a half process where I went back to school. Uh, I lost 110 pounds and got an age waiver and an eye waiver and came in. And a year later was in Helmand Province, Afghanistan, with the Marine Corps Infantry Battalion, um, and experiencing what it was like to be in war,
Hmm.
literally being there by Marines and sailors for that. And then fast forward a few years to 2020, and I was accepted into a Navy program for to be able to work in a hospital. And in order to be able to work in a hospital, a chaplain, you have to have what's clinical pastoral education. So the Navy has a program for that on the East and the West Coast, and it's partnered with the Veteran Affairs. And so I would go to school on Tuesdays and Thursdays. And for the first 6 months, I did a residency at Naval Hospital San Diego, which was during the height of COVID, and I was the ICU chaplain. I saw more death there than I actually saw in Afghanistan because we were losing at least one person a day,
Hmm.
and trying to comfort the families, and but then also trying to comfort the healthcare workers because they were just absolutely demoralized
Sure.
at that time because they were just horrified that they felt so helpless. And then during the second 6 months, I did a residency with the VA Medical Center there in San Diego, and they placed me in what was called a PTSD domiciliary. And the name of this place is called the Aspire Center. And if anybody from the VA is listening, please, please, please replicate this in other cities. Um, because what they did was they took homeless vets off the streets of San Diego who were diagnosed with PTSD. They would house them for 6 months, help them to get clean, address their PTSD and moral injury and other issues to help them stay clean. Would help them find housing and a job so that they didn't go back out on the streets. And they had an 85% success rate.
Well, okay.
And it's just an amazing program. The staff there is just so dedicated to these residents while they're there. And what I really enjoyed about being the chaplain there, or the chaplain resident there, because they have a full time chaplain there, the chaplain had an equal seat at the table. The chaplain just wasn't a nice person who would comfort people and say nice things and pray occasionally. The chaplain had a seat at the table and had a part of the plan for addressing how the issues the resident had was going to be addressed during the 6 months that they had him. And that
Hmm.
was just wonderful. And working with their PTSD and the moral injury. And so then when I graduated from that and went to my follow on tour, there's always a payback for school. Uh, we came out here to the beautiful desert oasis of 29 Palms, California, smack in the middle of. Uh, but as I came to the Naval Hospital here, I went to my leadership and I said, for these folks to be on the streets of San Diego before we really try to address this. And
Mm.
I know that we have very hardworking mental health care workers that are trying to address PTSD and hopefully moral injury as well. Why can't we complement that with something that would just reinforce what they're getting, and especially addressing it from the spiritual realm?
Right.
And so my leadership totally bought off on it. I took a program that was developed by a psychiatrist and a chaplain and tweaked it for active duty. And we started doing it here and started seeing incredible results, and just so excited over that. And that led me to uh, think about PTSD and moral injury and the average chaplain, the average pastor outside of the gates of a military base. How much do they really know? Um, and in talking with my pastors that I've had during my time in the Navy, if I mentioned PT, quite frankly, a lot of the times they would be able to give me a pretty decent definition. PTSD is fear-based trauma. it happens to you. It breaks you down emotionally, where you are paranoid, you are, uh, concerned for your safety at all times. You're hyper
Mhm.
vigilant. I know because thanks to that first deployment. Um, and then also, uh, but then I would say, so let's talk about, and it would be like a deer in headlights.
Yeah.
But then when I explained moral injury, which is, you've got PTSD as fear based trauma, moral injury is about when we choose to do something, or sometimes are ordered to do something by those in authority over us, or we may decide we're not going to get involved. And the end result in any one of those just completely goes against everything we believe in morally, ethically, and especially spiritually.
Sure.
That it just breaks us down, it eats us up with guilt and shame. And in the words of some of my folks, it fractures your soul.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And that is something that I think not enough people are aware of what you just described, what moral injury is, and they may know that something is happening to them from any of those levels, the spiritual, the all those different levels there, but not being able to necessarily put a label on it and then be able to say, okay, how do we address this and identify what the problem actually is, and then go from there. Obviously, mental health professionals, they're aware of what that is, and they probably can spot it out in certain circumstances. But from an individual standpoint, uh, who someone who's dealing with some sort of moral injury, if they're not aware of what that actually is, then they may not know even the right course of action to take and who to go reach out to, and what does that next step look like. And it's difficult when you don't really have a roadmap in front. I mean, a lot of progress has been made over the last 10, 15 years or so in terms of mental health, and uh, not just the availability of it, but even just the stigma surrounding it, and how people address. I know from my own standpoint, being deployed 2010 to Afghanistan, when I got back home, I didn't want to go talk to anybody because I felt like that was like the weak thing to do, or like that was for the real crazy people, and I didn't need to go do that. And so, that type of thing was the mentality back then, and the tide has definitely shifted with all of that now. And I think more people are uh, willing and able to go and talk with people than they were before. The stigma is kind of I think over the years, which
I
I think
agree.
is a good thing.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's still there to some point.
Hmm.
As I work with active duty Marines and sailors, there's still definitely a stigma,
Sure.
but um, it's nothing like what it was in 2010. And I know because I was in Afghanistan the first half of 11. And just going from then to now, the shift in stigma and is huge.
Sure.
You have more commanding officers now saying, "Oh, get help."
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Not only that, but I've even heard from some who are leading by example and telling their groups like, "Hey, I'm going to a mental health appointment right now, and that's where I'm going to be for the next hour, or whatever the time period is." And letting them know, like, that's an okay thing to do. It's not like you need to go tiptoe around it and hide, or anything like that. Like, it's an okay thing to do, and they're showing that by kind of just leading by example. And in some cases, maybe whether they really truly need it in terms of it being a major issue on their end, or maybe they're just doing it just to show that it's an okay thing to do. Whatever the case may be, is I think a good thing, because that opens that door to a possibility. Hey, it's okay for me to go. My captain, or my whoever is going and doing it too. So okay, well, cool. Then I guess I get to do it, and it's not that big of a deal. I mean, it is a big deal, but it's not a negative big deal type of thing. Um, and so, from your experiences through all the work that you've done, the Aspire Center, is that what you it was? Yeah. In there and, other places through, the types of work that you've done, um, things that you've seen impacting people, maybe they're from a faith, with regards to the trauma like PTSD or moral and stuff like that. How do you see it anyways affecting people on faith or spiritual side?
Well, you know, trauma can have a huge effect on a person's spirituality or faith. Uh, and when moral injury sets in, um, moral injury causes that person, and trauma, whether it's PTSD or moral injury, can do. It can set in, and it can cause that person to just back away from everything.
Mhm,
They will back away from their family. They will back away from their friends. They will back away from their faith, uh, where they no longer. Uh, from the PTSD perspective, they may feel like they no longer lost their faith,
mhm,
that they're failing because of what the trauma that has happened to them. From the moral injury perspective, quite frankly, many times because they're just so full of guilt and shame, they're afraid that they're and unforgivable because of the actions that they have done.
mhm.
And uh, they don't even feel like they're even forgivable by God.
Sure.
And in many cases that I've seen, where they kind of back away from everything because they feel shattered inside, or maybe another word might be could. They're actually afraid that their corruption could rub off on others.
Mm. Interesting. Yeah, I hadn't actually thought of it that way. I mean, I understand the, maybe the unlovable or unforgivable, that side of things, but I never really thought of it from the, my, uh, whatever it is that I did, whatever that negative thing is on my end, corrupted in some way, and that's an interesting way to look at it. Obviously, that's not a true statement, for the folks who are listening. Like that's not true. You're not going to rub off onto somebody else. You're not unlovable or unforgivable, from any of those perspectives. Um, and so, how do you help kind of guide people through all of that, to them to kind of change on that end?
Well, the first thing we do is listen. We listen and we sit with them in their pain, and we don't try to come up with a quick fix, because that's a quick fix isn't going to work. Um, you know, Usually what brought them to this point isn't something that happened very quickly over a period of time. And it may be, quite frankly, decades since the event happened or series of events happened. Um, and so they need time to really kind of begin thinking about that and processing this. And we do is we listen to their story and we sit with them in their pain, and um, we model what it is to be God's love for them, to just have that unconditional love, and for them to slowly begin to feel like maybe I can one day be lovable again. Maybe I can one day be forgiven.
Sure.
Uh, and it was interesting. Um, I was teaching a suicide prevention course, or actually a suicide intervention course, the other day, and one of the staff sergeant, actually, as he was modeling using the program, he made a statement, and I thought, I'm so stealing that for working with the people that I work with. And nothing I do is original. We just repackage it well.
Sure.
Um, but he said, you know, to the individual as they were doing their role play, and this just popped out of it, said, um, you don't have to be forgiven right now to choose to move forward.
Mm.
Thought to myself, that is such a true statement.
Right. Right.
Um, and then as we listen, as we sit with them, as they listen to each other, they become a cohort um, of people who trust one another through shared stories.
Hmm.
And then we also do that we work with them on. We work with them on why there is evil in the world. We work with them on uh, forgiving self and forgiving others. Even sometimes they feel like they have to forgive God, which may seem like a weird statement, but getting to the point where they'll even talk to God.
Sure.
We do several things that we do with them during the course of time, because this is an 8-week course that we use. And we'll do one thing we do is called a two-way prayer log or two-way prayer journal. And everybody when you go to a mental health professional, many times they'll tell you you need to journal your feelings. And that's absolutely correct. There's a lot of thing about it's very helpful to be able to put your feelings down on paper. It's very cathartic. But we kind of take it a step further. We said what we want you to do is we want you to write out your prayer to God. And then after you've done that, read through it and then write out how you think God would answer. And that's the two-way part.
Okay.
And these folks, through everything they're experiencing, whether it's PTSD or moral injury, through everything they're experiencing, they've kind of gotten um, pigeonholed in how they view everything. It's all about what they've done or what has happened, and it's very hard for them to kind of get out of themselves and even to look at their situation from, uh, as we all say in the military, the 20,000-foot view.
Sure.
And so if they begin to look at that prayer and then begin to look at how would God answer that, it helps them to begin to see things from outside of their own perspective. How does God begin to view me?
Hmm.
Maybe the way I think of myself isn't really how God sees me.
Right.
And that begins to open themselves up uh, to seeing things from more than one perspective.
Right. And at that point, it seems like there's another possibility other than that one narrow view of yourself, which, we can be our own worst enemy a
Yeah,
lot of times with the way we think about ourselves, the way we beat ourselves up and talk to ourselves, that inner monologue that we have. And when you open yourself up to that possibility that there's some other way of viewing yourself without going and asking somebody else, hey, how do you think about, what do you think about me, or something. That's maybe kind of a weird question to ask somebody, but then you're opening it up to that possibility that there's some other way of someone looking at you or thinking about you or whatever. And if there's version of that, why can't there be two others or three others? And some so um, you know, just because your view of yourself is negative or some bad yourself doesn't mean that everybody's view is negative, and there might actually be some good there and that you're just overlooking, right?
completely correct. And then what we'll do is at the next session, we'll say, has God said anything to you in your two-way prayer journal? And it's amazing how these guys, and well, not just guys, but ladies
Mhm.
too, it's amazing how these folks will open up and they'll share passages that they've written from the week, and then they'll share what they thought could be God's perspective. And then it is just confirmed and reinforced by the other members of the group who, and sometimes they'll say, yes, I believe that. Yes, I think that's what God would say. Or sometimes they'll say, I needed to hear that too.
Mhm.
I needed to hear that message myself. And it just reinforces that idea of seeing things from a different perspective.
Yeah.
Another thing we'll do is, the Psalms have um, a lot of scripture that just has looking at situation, when David messed up Psalm. And you know, and some of those Psalms in there you can use. Like one thing we'll do is we'll take Psalm 51 and we'll tell them to rewrite Psalm 51 using things that's happened in their own life.
Okay.
And then they'll and we'll use other psalms as well, but then they'll bring it that next week and they'll read it to the group, and it's just amazing the effect that it has on everyone in the room.
Yeah, that's interesting way an interesting way to look at it, because there are a lot of just call it like timeless lessons that are incorporated there, that somebody else has made same mistakes that we've made, and they learned from it, and then they wrote about it, and then they now that's out there for everybody to pick up and read and learn from, and in a way that also tells you, hey, I'm not the only one who's maybe made them or done something I wasn't so proud of, or whatever the case may be. And how did this person deal with it?
Yeah,
And yeah.
and David's a perfect picture of recovery from moral injury.
Sure.
Look at, I mean, he started out. Uh, just think of how he started out. Being just a kid fighting for God, and his king tries to kill him. That'll give you PTSD.
I'm sure. Yeah.
And then he stays honorable through all of that. But then later, as he becomes king, he ends up setting up the murder of one of his own men in order to cover up his shame uh,
Hmm.
of sleeping with the man's wife and getting her pregnant. And then when he's confronted with that sin by the prophet Nathan, David could have been rebellious, but instead he got on his knee. Well, actually, he laid down on the floor and wept and prayed for God's forgiveness. And we see him coming back to God. Now, does he make mistakes? Absolutely, he does. But even through all of that, he was still called God's friend.
Sure. Yeah. And if you think about it, like, which one of us hasn't made a mistake at some point or another? Like, no, none of us are perfect. We've all made some mistakes, some things that maybe we're not proud of, and might even be embarrassing, or just things that happen to people. And so, like, you're not alone when it comes to that. We all have had certain things in our lives somewhere along the line that we made a mistake. We screwed up. We did the wrong thing. We said the wrong thing. We went to the wrong place. Whatever it was, we did something wrong. And that's, I think, part of being human. And unfortunately, sometimes we beat ourselves up so much that it's types of injuries, right?
Oh,
These
yeah.
these moral injuries, right?
And we just isolate ourselves. But if we can start getting them to share their story, to trust,
Hmm.
and that's where I think uh, the church needs to really hone how to do that.
Yeah.
Because if the pastor doesn't know what more is, not because they've been neglectful, just simply because they haven't been educated on it,
Hmm.
then what about the people in the congregation?
Right.
And but if we can teach the pastors and then teach the churches how to listen to these stories without judgment, because sometimes they're hard to hear.
Hmm.
But if we can begin to listen to these stories without judgment, then they're not going to feel so much like a monster anymore.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. And when you're able to say something and you're not getting that look from the other person that's
Right.
sitting across from you, it makes it that much easier to be able to actually have that conversation versus someone who is judging you and thinking, oh my gosh, this person is a nightmare, and this person's terrible, and all that kind of stuff. Then kind of clam up and not want to share anymore. And that's a big part of it, is being able to get it out and share it and everything. And part of what you were talking about earlier, and I imagine this is a big piece of it, is that there are, you know, groups of people coming together and working through these kind of classes and all this stuff together, but community and support of other people who are maybe going through them at the same time. Obviously different circumstances or whatever, but they might be dealing with some of the same. Whether it's moral injury or PTSD or what it may be, but healing together in terms of a community might be beneficial, so long as you're not sitting there with people who are just sitting there and judging you the whole time, right?
Exactly. If the community can come alongside and show care and support, that's going to go so far in restoring these folks from their
Mhm.
brokenness.
Yeah, absolutely. And more so than just the individuals who might be dealing with this on their own, the greater community too. Even within your family or your whatever your social group is, or maybe it's at your church. Maybe there's a church has a veterans group that gets together and talks about these types of things, or
Mhm.
whatever this may be. It's important to have those folks who are understanding of what's going on, not necessarily understanding it like been there and I know what you're going through kind of thing, but understanding it from a conceptual level, kind of what like we're talking about so far. You don't have to have gone through it yourself to understand what we're talking about. I don't think, anyways, right?
Well, and that's driven by just look at the folks at the VA. There are many people at the VA who have never been in uniform,
Right.
but they have dedicated their lives to helping those who have been.
Hmm.
And, they were at the Aspire Center, and then plus the people that I worked with at the main VA hospital, many of them had never served, but they were giving their all
Yeah.
in order to help those who had and help them come back from the trauma that they've experienced. And like when I was talking with these pastors from across the United States and various places where I've been stationed, when I explained what moral injury is, every single one had, oh, I know someone that describes perfectly.
Right. Right.
And
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
then as we talked about it, they were like, okay, I've got a new way to approach this person and and not just try to fix it.
Yeah. Right, exactly, because there may not be that, tool in the toolbox where you can just go and turn a few screws and get it fixed just right away, and like you may not be able to be forgiven right away, but doesn't mean you can't start working on it. That type of mentality. But I know there's probably some veterans out there, and other folks maybe even who are going through some of this stuff, more PTSD, that type of thing, that they're dealing with, but they just don't know how to communicate it with maybe their family members, a spouse or close loved ones or friends even, who maybe don't know really what they're going through and they can't really understand, uh, or they feel like they can't understand. And what are some of the better approaches to be able to bring these types of things? You don't feel like you're necessarily going it alone, especially at home or in your social groups.
Yeah, especially, I mean, if you're at a church and your church doesn't have a veterans group, start one,
Mhm.
you know, and just go out to coffee. Or maybe you're not a veteran, maybe you're a healthcare worker, but you've experienced trauma as a healthcare worker. Start a group for that. Uh,
Mhm.
because, the VA and Duke University did a study that during COVID, healthcare workers experienced more morally injurious events than the average soldier who experiences combat.
Hmm. Yeah,
And
interesting. Yeah.
after what I saw at the ICU, I don't doubt that at all.
Mhm.
Uh, but or find a veterans group, find a VFU. Also, the called building spiritual strength. If you're part of a VA and your VA offer building spiritual strength, the VA nationally offers building spiritual strength groups online. you can go into the va.gov and just in the search type building spiritual strength. And that page for that will pop up. And then there are people that you can contact in order to be able to get into a group online.
Okay. Excellent.
That
Yeah.
would be very helpful. And if you feel comfortable, go and talk to your pastor and just say, Pastor, this is how I feel. I don't want to be looked at like a monster.
Hmm.
This is how I feel. And and if the pastor's worth their salt, no pun intended. Uh, but you know, then they're not going to look at you like a monster. They're
Sure.
gonna they're gonna love you with the unconditional love of God.
Yeah. And I know it's hard sometimes when you're bringing this stuff home. You don't, like you said earlier, you don't want to, quote unquote, like maybe affect or infect your family with this type of stuff. You don't want to burden them with this type of stuff either. But at some point, they're probably going to wonder, like, hey, what's going on with you? What's happening? And
And at some point, hopefully, as you've begun to walk that path back to restoration,
mhm,
at some point, you're going to need to share some things with the people closest to you,
sure,
because probably up to this point, you've done some pushing away.
hmm,
And I can think of more than one person in the group we've been in. I'm thinking of one man in particular. Um, he joined our group as a retiree, not active duty, but because many military bases, and one of our chaplains, he was known as the office grump. I bet you're picturing somebody right
I
now.
am,
He was known as the office grump, and one of our chaplains was deck plating, which is a Navy term for just visiting the spaces, visiting the office. And the chaplain mentioned to the gentleman, a friend of mine is starting this group at the Naval Hospital. Um, this might be something that would be good for you. And he actually signed up, and I did the screening with him. Um, and he came that first night, and we weren't really sure he was going to come back. Uh, he came. He had the perpetual scowl, or as a friend of mine says, resting mean. And you know, uh, and you know, but as people usually share that first night, we'll ask them what brings them in, and they'll almost everybody will do a tentative share because they're not sure how everybody else is going to react.
hmm,
But then when they realize that the other people in the group are not recoiling in terror from them, then they begin to open up more.
yeah, right,
And, and then after that initial week, he came back the next week, and we give them homework. That this isn't just you show up for a couple hours and then you don't think about it. We give them homework. We give them that 2-week prayer journal every week. There's an assignment that we give them that they have to work on something, or read something, and then come back, be prepared to talk about it the next week. And he took the notebook that we gave him that had the schedule, and he took it to his VA counselor. And he said, I've signed up for this class for the next 8 weeks. This is what we're going to be doing. And I don't know the name of this VA counselor. All I can say is she's brilliant, because she adapted her counseling sessions so that the topic of the sessions reinforced what we were going to be doing in that class that week.
oh, that's excellent, yeah. Yeah, so they kind of work hand in hand as opposed to just
So that,
two
so that
completely separate. Yeah,
each one was complementing the other.
right.
I knew the name of this person. I would say it. I don't know it, but when he came back the next week and told us that that's what he had done, first we were a little shocked. We were really sure he was coming back,
Right.
but then over the course of the 8 weeks, we started to see the dropping of the guard. Not the resting mean face was starting to chip away, And then the last week, he came in and he said, for 20 years, I've hidden everything I did on deployment from my wife
Mm.
because I was afraid if I told her, she would call me a monster and leave. But then this group has taught me that I'm not a monster. And I've decided to tell my wife what's been going on with me for the last 20 years. And I remember uh, we, we got together as a group. We prayed for him as a group. We all thing as veterans will do. Um, but that was the last night. So uh, I saw him a few months later. I wasn't sure I was staring at the same
Okay.
because he had dropped 50 pounds. He was laughing and smiling and joking with people he didn't even know in the hospital because at that time I was the hospital chaplain.
Hmm.
And so I saw him come down the hallway and I called him out and he came up and gave me a hug. With, are you the same person? You know? And, but he told me that night he went home and told his wife, he said, honey, I need to tell you some things. And of course, that gave her a little fear and trepidation.
Sure.
But then as he began sharing some things, he said she began crying.
Mhm.
And when he was done, he was shaking, literally shaking, because he wasn't sure what was going to happen.
Mhm.
And she jumped up and hugged him and and thanked him for sharing this with her. And she said, I'm so grateful you're trusting me. I'm
Right.
so grateful you're trusting me. I love you. And instead of rejection, he got unconditional love.
Hmm.
And when he got that unconditional love from his wife and then was able to kind of reconcile with his children because he'd been keeping them at arm's length as well, then he stopped eating his pain. Thus, the weight dropped off.
Sure.
And he stopped holding in all of that grief, angst, guilt, and shame and started having joy back in his life again. His relationship with his faith was renewed. And, it was funny that, as that chaplain would deck plate, some of the folks were saying, what did you do to him? He's a completely different person. And it's just amazing to see them when they journeyed down that path of restoration, the joy that they have in their face now. And I see him every couple of months now when we get together for planning for an exercise. And, he's smiling, slapping people on the back, comes up, gives me a hug. And it's just a blessing. And that's not the only story we have.
I'm sure, and I'm glad that you were able to share that particular story because some folks are probably out there thinking that exactly this guy was thinking that they're gonna look at I'm a monster, that I'm this terrible person, and I want them to think that of me. So I'd rather keep them at arm's length so that they don't think that way of me, or I don't want to burden them with this or anything like that. But um, I I've said this before to some other folks that I've had on the show. You know, what if you flip the script and they're having trouble with whatever they're dealing with something, maybe the same thing that you're dealing with, and put yourself in their shoes, and if they didn't come to you and ask for, not even ask for help, but even just tell you what's going on or something, how would that make you feel? Would you feel like, oh, they feel like they can't trust me? That's not a great feeling. Or they feel like they need to hide these things from me. Well, that's not a great feeling either, right? And so all of these things, if you put yourself in shoes, think, how would you react, or how would you feel if they were ones keeping the things from you? And in a lot of cases, I would imagine that it would probably not be so great. And so, why wouldn't you share it with them? And why wouldn't you want to
Who's
open up?
supposed to be the most important in your life?
Sure, right. Yeah, and like, I understand, like, from some people's perspectives, they don't wanna ruin those relationships, and they might think that, well, these relationships are gonna be shot if I open up in this, but, those people who, to your point, these are the most important relationships that you have, they're gonna want you to get better and want to help you and want to understand what you're going. So when you're acting in a particular kind of way, they maybe can wrap their head around it and maybe help talk you through it, or something, along those lines, um, as opposed to just being completely in the dark and not having any idea why you're keeping that person away, why you're acting the way you are, or saying the things that, if you open up and you're sharing it with that person, at least they know. And, not that they need to become a counselor overnight or anything, but at least they have an idea of what you're going through, and it can kind of make some sense to them, and maybe they can help out in some way too, right?
Yes, very
So
much, because they care. They're some of the most important people in your life.
right.
And I know that we did try to flip the script a little bit on him, and I remember him saying, "My wife's never killed anybody."
Yeah, well, that
And
is
we said, "That's true." I said, "But do you think there's some things that she's done that she would feel horrible about telling you?"
mm,
And he goes, "Yeah, I guess probably so."
sure.
It just, you know, we have that phrase, something bad happens and we'll say, "But did you die?"
Right. Right. Exactly.
So we tried to put things in perspective, but some of those in the civilian world don't have that perspective.
Mhm. Yeah,
Yeah.
and it's hard to get that perspective without kind of being in there, and until you start hearing some of the stories and maybe starting to understand a little bit about where they're coming from. I know in my case, I had written a book about my experience in Afghanistan and all the things that we went through, and guys that I served with, they were in that, or they didn't want to talk to their spouses about the the stuff that they went through, and they just kind of clammed up. They didn't want to talk, about any of it. But then after I wrote the book, some of the and got a copy of the book, and they read it, and they came to their husbands and said, "I understand what you're going through," because they were able to read it from somebody else's perspective, but they were able to understand a little bit more about some of the stuff that they had experienced, and they were grateful that that book was available, that story was available to be able to understand that. But had those guys opened up and mentioned it earlier, it might have saved some heartache or some pain and suffering kind of along the way. And I'm not saying everyone has to do exactly what I'm saying here. Everyone has to do their own thing at the right time, but the longer you wait, the harder it becomes, I think, with opening up and sharing some of this stuff, and you kind of a routine or a habit of keeping people at that arm's length, that becomes, unfortunately, it becomes comfortable for you, and when you do that, it's hard to get uncomfortable with it and bring them back in, right?
Absolutely. I mean, I was guilty of that myself. I
Sure.
mean, I did not talk about my experience in Afghanistan with anyone other than fellow service members.
Hmm.
And it wasn't until after I got back from my last deployment that my wife actually confronted me, and she said, "I I I want to know." And I said, "No, you don't." You know that. And she goes, "No, really. I want to know, were you really in any danger over there?"
Hmm.
And I said, "Yes, I was." And she said, "I can I ask some details?" And I said, "Are you sure? Because some of this may be hard to hear." It's not that I didn't kill anyone or anything,
Hmm.
but where my because she had experienced my my sense having any safety. We were at a football game once where I flashed. I had a flashback and actually threw her to the covered her.
Mm-hmm.
If you've ever been to Tampa, the football stadium there in Tampa has a life-size pirate ship.
Mm-hmm.
And a buddy of mine at the time, actually, one of my very best friends in the Navy is a rabbi, and we were in Afghanistan together, and his brother for the Buccaneers. And so when I got stationed with the Coast Guard, because the Coast Guard uses Navy chaplains in Tampa, he got us preseason tickets. So these tickets were smack in front of the pirate ship. And so we're sitting there, and he and his girlfriend come by, and we're having a very pleasant conversation, not paying attention to the game. I did not know that when the Bucks scored, they fired the cannons on the ship.
Yeah. I had a feeling that's where this was going.
So, we're not paying attention. We're just talking, and the cannons went off behind me, and I was there. I was
Mm-hmm.
right back there. And it didn't matter who was next to me. And happened to be my wife. Uh, I grabbed him, threw her to the ground, and laid on top of her, and then realized,
Yeah.
of course, I look up, and my friend and his girlfriend are looking at me like I've lost my mind. And I just said, I flashed back.
Yeah.
And of course, he had heard his brother talk about his experiences with his battalion in Afghanistan. And he goes, okay, Josh talked about this.
Mm-hmm.
And, so my wife was like, I know something happened,
Yeah.
And she had experienced it, my going to a restaurant and always sitting with my back to the wall and looking at all of the exits and everything. And so finally I had told her, we've been in a few firefights, and, chaplains don't have any weapons. It's just the sword of the Lord in me and my RP keeping me safe. And my RP did save my life. He moved me out of the way just as a burst of machine gun fire landed where I was previously standing. And then a little later, my Marines had discovered a cache of weapons and some documents. And the interpreter was saying, Chaps, you're in here, when he was reviewing the documents. And I said, what are you talking about? And here that if you kill the Marine's holy man, it will demoralize him. Well, truth be told, it would just make him madder.
Yeah, you don't want to do that.
No,
that's kicking a hornet's nest. You don't want to do that.
That's kicking a hornet. The Marines would have gone scorched earth after that. And I said, oh, really? And he goes, no. Below this is you and RPs.
Oh, wow.
So someone had gotten close enough to us to see us write down our descriptions and put this in here so that everybody in the area knew who I was and to put a target on our heads.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so those types of things.
Understanding that I don't have much of a sense of safety these days.
Yeah, no, exactly. And that's one of the things that I was going to say is like, while you didn't physically do the things that some other people did, you weren't out there shooting at the people, but those things still happened. The things that you just described still happened, and that affects you in one way or another. And
Yes.
it'll affect everybody differently, for sure. Some people, that's just, hey, that's just another day out in the field or whatever. And some people it's going to affect a lot more. And there's no right or wrong way to feel about that. There's
right.
We're all human, and we have different ways of looking at it and different ways of experiencing those types of things. It is just what it is. And that's, it's but something that you have to deal with when done, when the dust settles and everything. You have to be able to figure out a way to deal with that. And it seems like a lot of these programs, a lot of the groups and things that you've been talking about are great ways to be able to work your way through this stuff and communicating with people and opening up and talking about it and normalizing it in a way. Not saying that everybody has to have this type of experience. That's not what I mean by normalizing, but normalizing it in terms of saying like, hey, it's okay to talk about this, and you're not, as a matter of fact, you're human. I might think you're crazy if you didn't have any sort of reaction to some of these things, right? And that might be the kind of the way that going forward we start to help more people is
Yeah.
opening up to that, right?
If you think about it, less than 11% of veterans get mental health help.
Hmm.
And half of that number drops off just shortly after going to sessions.
Hmm.
Um, but if we can get them in some type of supportive group, then they are far more likely to get some complementary help. And if even better, if you can have a spiritual guide as well as, a mental health helper, and then the group, that's a triple whammy in helping that person
Yeah.
to come back from their trauma.
Right. Exactly. And yeah, these types of groups are all over the place, and I think they, for the individuals out there who are listening, it's really just a matter of taking a look and trying to find what's area, or even some online groups like the one that you mentioned earlier, what is it, the building spiritual strength group that's available
And
online as
VA
well.
has launched another program called that is similar,
Okay.
and that has been helping. Uh, and then if you can get in there, uh, for instance, my friend Dr. Carter Check, who is at the Tulsa VA, no, Muskogee VA, sorry, Carter, but he runs a ministry called Hun Therapy, and
Okay.
it's basically where and just Google Hun Therapy Carter Check, um, and it's in stations in the country where they go either hunting or fishing or even golf or rough water rafting, and then using that in groups of in to begin to rebuild resiliency.
Yeah. Yeah. And
And
and the nice thing is there's so many different ways that you can approach this, like you're just saying, whether it's, any of those outdoor activities or getting together in a group, and sharing things, talking about things different. There's so many different ways that there's a way for everybody to deal with this type of stuff in their own way, in a way that will with them.
yes,
Maybe you're not the outdoorsy type and none of that stuff interests. Well, then let's put that aside. We're not going to worry about that for you, but there might be something else. There's so many different things out there. And it's part of the reason why this show even exists is to shine a light on those types of things, because you only know what you know. I mean, we're all familiar with the VA and that the VA has stuff to offer, but there's stuff out, even outside the VA. There's stuff,
yes,
through there's new programs that are being introduced in the VA all the time, and so just being aware of these things that even exist is sometimes half the battle, because if you don't even know that they're there, you're not going to go and find them necessarily. So that
absolutely.
this is exactly what I wanted to try to get across in this episode here too, is our different approaches, and some of them could be spiritual, faith based type things, and some not, but they. I think if you just focus on one area of your life without incorporating the full picture, kind of a more holistic view, including your spirituality and faith and things, like you might not be getting the whole picture, and so there might be some other areas that you need to explore as well. This is a great example of some of that stuff that I'm talking about.
Yeah, I
Um,
completely agree.
um, Before we wrap up, I know we're getting close on time here. Before we wrap up, is there any other resources or any you might want to direct some of the listeners to go learn about, maybe any of the stuff that you're in particular working on, or other people that you know of that have been doing great things that you want to share?
Well, as I mentioned, my friend Dr. Carter Check, He has written some resources on moral injury. Terrific. I recently wrote a book, and it came out at the beginning of February. It's called Restoring the Broken. So I'll make sure that you have that website and my email that you can show notes,
Excellent.
and you can go there and you can get it on Kindle or in paperback or hardback. And what I did was I just simply wanted to talk about moral injury in very plain language. And especially, I wanted to challenge the church to get themselves educated on moral injury. It's kind of advertised as a book for ministry leaders, but to be truthful, I wanted to just put info about moral injury in plain language. So um, I've had I've had wives read this. I've had people who don't even go to church read this. Um, and who said it really helped them what moral injury is, to understand the one that they've been concerned with. I've had people with moral injury read it and say, "This makes my life now makes so much sense now," uh,
Yeah.
and then begin to take steps toward that path of restoration.
Yeah, absolutely. And I will have all the links to all the resources that you mentioned today. I'll have all those in the show notes for to be able to check out. So to make it nice and easy for them. But it has been an absolute pleasure chatting with you today. And I'm sure the listeners have enjoyed this conversation as well. So thank you so much for coming on the show, and thanks for all the work that you do, and folks who are struggling, and hopefully they're not much longer.
I sure hope so, and thank you. It's been a pleasure.